Good evening and warmly welcome to this webinar about industrial policy. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at a trade union-related think tank called Arenagruppen. And in that position, I'm responsible for a 5-year project on productivity and labor markets, financed by the 5 unions within Swedish industry. Our main guest today is Reka Juhasz. She is an assistant professor of economics at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She's a leading researcher on industrial policy and industrialization, and she's also a co-founder of the Industrial Policy Group. With us today, we also have Lena Sellgren, who is the chief economist at Business Sweden, and also part of the independent group of economists advising and supporting the social partners within Swedish industry. The setup for today is that Reka starts with a presentation for 30 minutes or so. Then there will be some opening remarks by Lena, and then we open up a discussion among the 3 of us, including questions from the viewers. So please state your short and sharp questions in the chat, and we will bring them up later on. All in all, we have 60 minutes at our disposal. And having said this, I leave the floor to you, Reka. The floor is yours. We cannot hear you now.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. No, thank you for that. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a huge pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you all about industrial policy. So what I would like to talk about today is really related to some recent research I've been doing. One is a working paper I have out with Nathan Lane, Emily Olson, and Veronica Perez, the who, what, when, and how of industrial policy. And the other one is a paper I have also with Nathan Lane and Danny Roderick, the New Economics of Industrial Policy. And I'll also sort of briefly touch on some work I've done with Claudia Steinwender on historical industrial policy. So I want to start really today by just sort of emphasizing that this question of whether states should shape the composition of economic activity, this is really sort of a foundational basic question across the social sciences that many thinkers have grappled with really since the birth of modern capitalism. So this idea, industrial policy, this idea that the state might want to use the variety of policy levers that it has at its disposal to either kickstart industrialization, or, to give a more modern example, something more relevant to the challenges that Sweden faces today, for example, whether the state should play a role in helping the economy or in shaping the economy's transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to an economy based on renewables. This idea, industrial policy, has been controversial since at least the late 18th century. So on one side of the debate, there is a long history of advocacy, starting with people like one of the US founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, followed amongst others by, on the European continent in Germany, Friedrich List, and more recently in the 20th century, academics such as Alice Ansden. This line of thinkers argues that not only can the state be helpful in shaping sort of the composition of economic activity in this way, but that in fact the state is sort of a necessary agent in transforming the economy and shaping the process of economic development. So this is one side of the debate, but there's also another strand of thinking that also has a similarly long tradition in the history of economic thought, and this view is more skeptical, taking the view that sort of at best this sort of industrial policy is ineffective, but that at worst it can be actually pretty harmful for the economy. So let me actually just start by giving you some visuals to look at. I want to illustrate sort of just how long-standing the skepticism around industrial policy is, and how a lot of the debates that we have today have roots in historical thought. This, I believe, is a satire from the early 20th century in the US, in which sort of the proverbial infant industry, this is the protected privilege, this is a wailing child who is clinging to their nurse or to their mother, which is the high tariff protection in this metaphor. And why are they wailing? Why are they crying? It is because they're being offered the bottle of open market competition. And I really enjoy, or I really like this satire, because I think it captures in a very sort of nice way one of the key sort of criticisms and one of the key controversies around industrial policy, which is that despite being well-intentioned or not, industrial policy may actually end up being nothing more than protected privilege, in which a lucky few industries, a lucky few firms, perhaps those that are politically well-connected, end up sort of getting handouts from the government without really sort of producing benefits to society. And I think it's safe to say that much of mainstream economics in the last few decades has really sort of sided with the skeptics. At its extreme, I could quote Gary Becker, who said that the best industrial policy is none at all. And one of the consequences of economists' sort of pretty, I would say, strong skepticism of industrial policy has been that for the past decades and until very recently, industrial policy was not really a subject of serious research within mainstream economics. It was not really an active field of study. Now, that has become somewhat problematic because, of course, as many of you will know, industrial policy, while it never went away, it has now become really the signature legislation of the Biden administration through Bidenomics. And so in that sense, economics is playing somewhat of a catch-up here vis-a-vis the way that policy has changed in recent years. And so just sort of off the bat, I want to start by making a couple of remarks. One is that given the way the global landscape, the global economic landscape has changed in recent years, I think it's safe to say that no matter what we think about industrial policy, no matter what sort of our priors are, industrial policy is simply a reality that economics can no longer ignore. And one of the things that I think, alongside my co-authors, we have been, the message, a very simple message that we've been trying to get out into the world is that we need less sort of ideological kind of knee-jerk reactions to industrial policy and more careful, quote unquote, mainstream work using sort of the tools of modern empirical theoretical economics to understand how industrial policy actually works in the real world. And what I want to do with my time today is to talk a little bit about how the new economics of industrial policy, what we with Nathan and Danny are calling the new economics of industrial policy, is an attempt to do just that, is an attempt to bring careful mainstream work to the study of industrial policy. So I'm going to make a kind of heroic effort today to cover sort of four main questions. And, you know, I have like 20 minutes left. So I'm going to do this at a very high level. I'm going to try to talk about what is industrial policy, what is the economic rationale for industrial policy, why we have seen historically a lot of skepticism in recent decades from economists. And then I want to talk at a very high level about what this new research on industrial policy is showing, what we know. And then I'm sure that in the discussion afterwards, I'll be touching a lot on the many things that we also don't know. Okay, so let me start with just a definition of what industrial policy is, as I think we found sort of thinking about this deeply, actually very clarifying for how we think about industrial policy. So I've already anticipated this a little bit with the very first slide, but I want to kind of give the formal definition here. So the way we think about industrial policy is that it is government action that explicitly seeks to transform the structure of economic activity. So it is the government trying to change the composition of what is produced, from agriculture to manufacturing, from fossil fuel-based economy to a renewables-based economy. So it is seeking to sort of change what is produced, and it is doing this in pursuit of some public goal, be this national security, be this the energy transition, be this to facilitate structural transformation. Now, the reason that we think that thinking about industrial policy in this way is very helpful is that this definition already has implications for some of the discourse that we see both in academia and in policy in the popular press about industrial policy. So first of all, I think industrial policy is often defined not in the way that we've just described, but it's defined based on specific policy levers. People think about tariffs, or people think about subsidies. I think thinking conceptually about industrial policy opens our eyes to the fact that many different things that the government does are industrial policy. If the government is putting in place workforce training programs to produce skilled workers who are able to produce advanced semiconductor chips, and that is in the service of some public goal, and this is articulated, that is industrial policy. Of course, there are other sorts of workforce development programs or education programs that won't necessarily be industrial policy. But again, this opens our eyes to the fact that industrial policy can basically be any lever that the government has at its disposal if it is used in a way that is consistent with trying to shape the composition of economic activity in the service of some goal. It's also clarifying because I think industrial policy is often also associated or basically defined as sectoral targeting. And again, that is one form of industrial policy that we see, and we see that very often. But it's not the only form. So we also see other ways in which the government may be trying to shape the composition of economic activity in some selective way that is not sectorally targeted. So a good example of this would be certain types of innovation policy. And then my personal pet peeve is that industrial policy is often sort of framed as being purely or synonymous almost with protectionist policy. And here again, of course, there is overlap. So famously, import substitution policy in the service of industrialization was protectionist. But again, in some of the research that Nathan and I have done, what we found is that actually a lot of contemporary industrial policy is much more outward focused, is oriented on getting firms to participate and subsidizing firms to participate in export markets. So in this way, I think taking this kind of broader and more conceptual view of industrial policy has helped us kind of organize the world in sort of a better way and deepen our understanding of what type of policies are industrial policy and which type of policies don't fit that definition. So the second question that I'd like to talk a little bit about is, what is the justification for doing industrial policy? And here, the main message that I want to convey is that the scope for policy intervention is the standard market failure argument. Similar to any other policy domain, the justification for doing industrial policy is that there is some reason why the market left to its own devices is not producing the socially desirable outcome. And this is what opens the door to the government coming in and making things better, bringing us closer to socially desirable outcomes. So point one is that, there's nothing sort of exotic about industrial policy in the sense that it conforms to the way that we think about the rationale for government intervention in terms of other policy domains. And I would also add that the types of market failures that justify industrial policy in particular are both sort of broad and they're also widely accepted. So we have a classification in the paper with Nathan and Danny in which we sort of organize these market failures based on 3 different classes. One are going to be externalities. These are typically positive externalities in which the activity that is undertaken by the firm or the entrepreneur is not recouped in the returns, in the revenues generated for that firm or that entrepreneur. There's some sort of spillover, there's some benefits to society that is not being captured by the person undertaking this activity. Okay, this is a very standard externality that we in sort of other economic fields, so in regional spatial economics, we take to be sort of the bread and butter market failure that exists in the real world. The other one that I want to highlight are activity-specific public inputs. So in this case, private production depends on the provision of public goods, which of course we typically think of being sort of very horizontal. It doesn't benefit, it's not targeted to certain selective activities. But actually, when you think about it, in many, many cases, this type of infrastructural policy often does have targeted benefits. So a very good contemporary example is the charging infrastructure, the EV charging infrastructure that needs to be built out in order for consumers to take up electric vehicles. That is a very activity-specific public input. And if the government is thinking about this policy in the service of the climate transition, this then becomes industrial policy. So I don't want to spend more time on this. I think that the message that we're trying to convey here is that these are not exotic market failures. These are sort of bread and butter market failures of Econ 101. There's nothing sort of really new that you need to believe about the world to believe that there's a rationale for a policymaker to do industrial policy. However, if that were the end of the story, then you might kind of rightly ask me, well, if things are so simple, why has there been so much controversy over industrial policy? And I think the way that we think about it is that most people who critique or most people who are skeptical of industrial policy potentially accept that these market failures exist and may possibly even be large. Their objections are practical. So in a nutshell, the objection is that the market failure might exist, but when in reality the policymaker comes in and tries to fix that market failure, they're going to make a bigger mess of things. So in plain English, the government failure involved in doing industrial policy is typically much, much bigger than the market failure that it seeks to correct. There are sort of 2 main classes of problems that skeptics worry about. The first is what you can think about as an information problem. It's all good and well for us here to talk about the variety of market failures that exist in the world, but of course, these aren't things that are very easy to go out and observe in reality. So one challenge the policymaker may face is that they just don't know what are actually the particular activities that they should be targeting. It's a version of the government can't pick winners critique of industrial policy. The second sort of main class of concerns comes back to sort of where I started with at the beginning, which is that industrial policy opens the door to political capture, meaning that in the end, when industrial policy is practiced in reality, what ends up happening is that it's not sort of the market failure that we're correcting, but it's rather that the system, the policymaker ends up giving handouts to the politically well-connected firms. So, I don't want to seem flippant about these concerns. I agree that these are sort of realistic and potentially serious concerns about industrial policy that we should be aware of. But I think what's been kind of interesting to us as we've sort of thought about the history of these debates around industrial policy is that in some sense, these are kind of, in every sense, I think these are empirical questions. And I think our profession's kind of strong turn against industrial policy coalesced really before economics became a much more empirically driven field. And so when you sort of look at sort of the critiques of industrial policy, particularly from the late 20th century, those are really based on sort of theoretical critiques, this idea that government failure is always going to be larger than market failure, and it has very little empirical content. And so really what the new economics of industrial policy does is it challenges this consensus. And I think it challenges this consensus in two ways. One is that it challenges this consensus with better measurement. And by that, I mean that work on industrial policy is now trying to move away from looking just at specific policy levers or just at sectoral targeting, and using this conceptual idea of industrial policy to look at the specific policies that conform to our definition of industrial policy. And what this tends to show is that, first of all, industrial policy likely never went away, but indeed it is on the rise, as I think we all perceive. And the thing that was kind of surprising to us when we first looked at the data, but the more that we look at it, the more it makes sense, is that I think contrary to a lot of people's beliefs and contrary to my sort of prior, what we find is that industrial policy is widely practiced in advanced economies and is much less prevalent in the poorest nations around the world. And second, the other big thing that the new economics of industrial policy has done is it's just brought better evidence to the table in terms of what industrial policy in the real world looks like. And even sort of to I think Nathan, Danny, and I, who were aware of much of the literature, sort of sitting down and writing this review piece on industrial policy made us kind of appreciate in a much more in-depth way that actually a lot of the best evidence we have on industrial policy provides a pretty positive take on the effects of industrial policy. And this is where I'm going to spend my remaining few minutes. So what I'm showing you here is some of the findings that we have from the paper with Lane, Olson, and Perez, in which we're using textual analysis of policies to classify which policies conform with the definition of industrial policy that I gave you. And indeed, we see that industrial policy activity has been on the rise in the past decade or so. But we also see, whether you break this down by regions or whether you break this down by quintiles of the income distribution, that no matter how we've cut the data, it seems to be the case that advanced economies, so the richest quintile of the GDP distribution, the GDP per capita distribution, or the richest regions of the world, are the ones that are engaging most intensively in industrial policy. So I want to talk about three types of empirical evidence about various forms of industrial policy that have emerged. One is public R&D, the other is place-based industrial policy, and the third is infant industry policy. And for each, we have some evidence of positive effects, with of course, the nuance and complexities that come with working in kind of real world environments. And these are not without caveats. So in terms of public R&D, the first thing that I want to start by saying is that I think historically or traditionally, economists' concerns with public R&D has been that it crowds out private investment, that spending $1 of government money on innovation, on R&D, is going to dissuade the private sector from undertaking that innovation. What we've actually seen from new work, partly at the micro level, is that public R&D actually seems to crowd in private R&D. This is from a nice recent paper in the AER by Myers and Lenahan. What I want to talk about also a little bit more is that where I think a lot of economists' sort of policy ideas revolve around thinking about kind of micro interventions to innovation. So in particular, what happens with innovation when we're changing incentives at the margin? There has been sort of a push, particularly from people like Mariana Mazzucato, to think about much more sort of moonshot, sort of major public R&D pushes in which the government gets much more heavily involved in sort of picking technologies, prioritizing which technologies are being pushed in the service, again, of some public goal. And we have two really nice papers that speak a little bit to the fact that sort of historically important, quote unquote, moonshots may have had, at least at the local level, pretty positive effects. One comes from the US's R&D effort during World War II. And this paper by Gross and Sampart shows that indeed this World War II R&D effort created local innovation hubs and potentially also changed the direction of US technology. So there's some results in their paper that tend to suggest that the US's sort of early lead in electronics was really sort of coming out of this World War II R&D effort. And then the other paper, Cantor and Wally, is analyzing the sort of the original moonshot mission, the US Apollo mission. And they also find that the Apollo mission had effects on manufacturing value added that are consistent with what we know about fiscal multipliers from other settings. And I think, this is not sort of the be all and end all of public R&D research, but I think, to the skeptics that claim that this is something that the government can never get right, that the government can't pick winners, for example, what we see from these efforts is that the US government seemed capable of picking technologies, places, and firms that could deliver the desired outcomes. And this actually often had long-lasting positive local effects, as these papers show. Okay. The second aspect of industrial policy research that I want to talk about is research that looks at place-based industrial policy. This is place-based policy. So this is regionally targeted policy that is not neutral in the sense that it is targeting certain activities within a region. So the typical place-based policy in practice is trying to boost manufacturing either in distressed or in lagging regions. And again, evidence from multiple contexts suggests that there are some positive effects on employment and in some cases, wages. The big concern around place-based policy in general, and place-based industrial policy is no exception to this, is that even if you sort of achieve what you're trying to do in one region, the worry is that what you're actually doing is you're just reallocating economic activity from slightly nearby to the targeted area. A lot of the research finds little evidence of these types of local spillovers, but where they find this sort of quote unquote leakage is through multi-plant farms, through the idea that farms that have multiple plants producing are going to sort of game the system by sort of taking whatever incentives are being given in the distressed or lagging region and sort of, because money is fungible, using that for their other plants. The final part of industrial policy that I want to talk about is where I've done some work, which has been on the sort of canonical infant industry argument. The idea being that sort of new sectors in countries that are not at the technology frontier, that they benefit from temporary protection. And here as well, new work finds positive effects for a lot of traditional infant industries, such as textiles, shipbuilding, and heavy industry. And where we seem to find evidence for the market failure that justifies these interventions is precisely these type of learning by doing external economies of scale that sort of traditional theories of infant industry emphasize. So I think, actually, given my time, I'm gonna stop there, and I'm happy to talk more about any of these strands if there are questions. But I think in terms of sort of thinking about where this leaves us in the current economic environment, I think for us as researchers, the task at hand is to normalize research on industrial policy in much the same way that we have researchers studying education policy, which works some of the time and fails in sort of other instances. And sort of much like other arenas of economic policy, instead of asking, whether the policymaker should be involved in doing industrial policy, the question we should really be asking is, how should we be doing industrial policy well? And again, I want to reiterate that these political economy challenges, the practical challenges to industrial policy that skeptics often point to, these are very real. But I think, as some of these episodes that I've talked through show, they're not insurmountable. And I think it's kind of incumbent on us to sort of think about how we can design policy to work around these challenges that exist in the real world. So I think I'll stop there.
Many thanks for this very, very clear presentation, Reka. Before I leave the floor to Lena, just one short question. When you say that the rich world is going faster on this industrial policies, can you see that the developing world is coming after, or is it kind of a structural problem for them to get there?
I mean, I think so it's a good question, and the data that we see really ends in 2022, and for a variety of kind of technical reasons, just because there's a lot of kind of backfilling of the data, it's hard for us to really see necessarily what's happening around the world. But what I would say is that just from sort of looking at this striking kind of difference between the rich and the poor world, the reason that we think that, all the measurement problems that might plague the data aside, there's a very sort of basic reason why rich countries do a lot more industrial policy. And it's that industrial policy, at least modern industrial policy, is fiscally very expensive. I mean, one of the big discussions that everyone is having currently is like, can we afford to be paying this? Can we afford to be doing industrial policy on this scale if we don't have the deep pockets of the US? If this is a problem, for countries like Canada or for countries like Sweden, think about the problems that this means for a poor country that whose fiscal capacity is just much smaller. So I think, in that sense, to me, it's almost, so ex post, it's almost obvious that this is what we're finding, even though it wasn't what I believed about the world before going in.
Thanks. Okay, Lena, do you have some remarks, please?
Yes. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me as well, and thank you, Reka, for a very interesting presentation, and also very rewarding what you do in the paper. I really like that you put the emphasis on the things that we see around us as well, because the world is changing. So we have the geopolitical tensions, and we have the green transition, and now we also need to invest a lot in defense as well. So there are a certain situation that means that also in Sweden and in the industrial economic council, which Daniel mentioned, where I'm a member, we are discussing these things. So it's very, very relevant as well, not least when it comes to how should you deal with this. A lot of countries, and it was interesting to read that it's the advanced economies mostly that use the industrial policy, and in a bit of a new way as well. So I think it goes a little bit back also to the geopolitical tension, the underlying tech race between the US and China, and then we have the EU, of course, where Sweden is part. So this is so interesting, and looking to, you have one very nice summarizing table 6.1. You can read it all that are listening in, because it's a very nice overview where you can see traditional industrial policy and this more contemporary new industrial policy and the differences and how you can think. So really rewarding and interesting to read this. And I have two questions that may be directly for you, Reka, or if we should discuss them more together. So the one is the three bodies, if we take the US, the EU, and China. There are others as well, but I think this is of importance because a lot of industrial production is taking place in these markets, and in particular, if you take North America, Europe, and Asia. So if we look into this, I mean, from a European perspective, we saw that when we have the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, in the US, and the CHIPS Act, and then we go a little bit behind, but in the EU, in Europe, we should have the same, because I think we need it. So I want you to reflect a little bit on this. And also in China, we have more of the state-owned companies, so a little bit of another situation. But the question is, do you see a risk that we follow each other to a too big extent, since you see that, could it be a subsidy race or some kind of race that could actually hurt, meaning that it will be more costly for all of us towards the end of the day? So that's one question, how you see this from your perspective. And the other one that we can move to, that I'm very curious and interesting on, you mentioned it a bit when you framed it, how do we do industrial policy in a good way? That's the question that we need to ask. So policy recommendations, how do we do this in a good way? Because there is a lot going on, not least in Europe. So that's another question that I think is important to raise. I stop there.
Reka, two questions for you. No, your speaker.
Yes. I always forget. So policy recommendations is the number one question that we get, and I'll be disappointing, but I'll try to say some things. And then I think to your question, let me start with your question about is there too much following? I guess one of the reasons, so where I would start is by thinking, and you mentioned CHIPS and IRA in particular, where I would start is thinking about what the goals of these policies are. And CHIPS, I think, is sort of the more difficult one, because I certainly don't see the national security intelligence that the US has, but there, I think, for me, front of mind is just the rationale there has a very strong national security geopolitical component. And so in that respect, I think the question for Europe is, do we see a similar national security risk? Is there something that the EU can be doing reasonably? I think reasonable people claim that the US has a shot at kind of redeveloping advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities. Whether that's going to be successful is I think a question. But one thing that I would say is that for CHIPS in particular, it's not clear that the benchmark of success, given the goals of the policy, it's not clear that the benchmark of success is that the US needs to sort of produce a world-beating advanced chip manufacturing industry. I mean, I think that's, everyone would love, in the US, everyone would love if that were the case. But, if the policy is a failure, in the sense that these firms are utterly unable to produce chips at any reasonable sort of quality and with any reasonable cost, I think there's a straightforward conclusion that maybe the US needs to get to there. If they're extremely successful and they're competitive without subsidies 10, 15 years down the line, that's great too. I think a much more tricky situation is, what happens if if the US or the EU is kind of close to the frontier, but it's always reliant on subsidies to keep pace. If we, if the rationale is that we want a strong chips industry, we should remove the subsidies. If the rationale is we're doing this for national security reasons, I think that then there's a very different sort of case to be made for how we judge the benchmark of success. So in terms of is there a subsidy race? Is there too much following? I think this was a long-winded answer about chips, for example. I think what you have to think about is, what are the goals of these policies? Is it important for the EU to have some of these capabilities themselves? Is it enough to rely on Western allies? Of course, the subsidy race, I think, is a legitimate concern. And I think there's an extent to which, at least within sort of the Western alliance, countries can be talking to one another and sort of thinking these things through. But this is, I think, why thinking about what the goal of the policy is important. The same, I think, is true for the Inflation Reduction Act. I think there is a very sort of strong case to be made for the fact that the technological innovation market failures, alongside sort of the negative carbon externalities, are a reason why the market is going to be both too slow and too slow at making the climate transition happen, and also sort of underinvesting in it. And so there, I think there's a strong rationale at a high level for the EU and the US to be both involved, whether they both need to be doing the same things, whether anyone needs to be producing solar at this point, given the Chinese cost advantage, is a different question. So there, I think I'm going to be boring, and I'm going to say these things are sort of case by case, technology by technology, industry by industry questions. I think it's obvious, to me at least, that the EU should have a green industrial policy, but which parts it focuses on, how it wants to complement kind of what China is already producing that may not be subject to the same national security threat, to what extent it should complement the strengths that the US has, is I think again what we should be questioning, and not, should the EU have green industrial policy at all. I think the devil is in the details, and there's a case to be made for a good European green industrial policy that plays to European advantages, and that is mindful of sort of what the rest of the world is already doing. In terms of policy recommendations, Nathan and I have a paper coming out in which we're trying to argue that one of the most important things about getting industrial policy right is to be mindful of political and capacity constraints. And I say this because I think as economists, we have a very natural tendency to focus on sort of the policy mix. Should we be doing demand side things? Should we be doing supply side things? Should we be using tariffs or export subsidies? Or that's the way that we've been trained to think. And I think where actually we see a lot of policy going off the rails is when a policy is implemented that just doesn't work within the current political context and the current sort of administrative context. So let me give you one case study example that we talk about in the paper at length, which is green industrial policy. So I think economists for a long time have advocated for carbon pricing as the solution, as the main sort of solution to the climate crisis. And there's a good reason for doing that, but we've also seen, and the US is a great example of this, that carbon pricing is politically extremely difficult to carry through. And so in that sense, when I look at the IRA, I say, what is the US administration doing? They are putting in place policies that are creating tangible benefits, political constituencies for the climate transition. Not only are they doing that, but a lot of the money, as you will likely know, is going to sort of traditionally climate hostile constituencies, to Republican districts, which is, again, a very smart policy move in the sense that through this policy, they may be cementing the political longevity of green policy in a way that could outlive the current administration if there's a change in who is the president next year. So in that sense, I think our sort of main message is we should, of course, think about designing sort of policy well, but we should be very, very mindful of the political constraints. And our models might tell us that the first best response is carbon pricing. That's the most efficient solution. But if that is eminently unworkable, and in the US, we know that that is just not a political reality, then we should think about sort of what we should also be thinking, not just about sort of what is the best technocratic policy that we can design, but also what is a policy that is actually going to work, that's actually going to have longevity, and that's actually going to produce results that we want.
Thanks. Lena, do you have a follow-up on that, or are you satisfied with the answers?
Thank you so much. I'm very satisfied with the answer. The short follow-up is that I think you agree on this, but I see that it's never good to have one dominant player, which is the case when it comes to semiconductors, for example. Another one from a European perspective is the Critical Raw Material Act.
Right.
We have a CHIPS Act in Europe as well. So, I mean, if we are dependent on rare earth metals, import 100% from outside the EU, and it's from one specific country mainly, and authoritarian, and then you have the security reasons, national security, but you also have a risk for not reaching the climate goals. So you need to have access to strategic raw materials, for example. So then I think it's good to, from the European perspective, the Critical Raw Material Act, the 3 pieces in it, which is actually keep up with trade, of course, as much as possible. But then we also need to have extraction of raw materials, strategic raw materials within the EU, of course, and also think more circular. So I think it's a good way that we do it within the EU. So you have more incentive-based and still go for trade as much as possible, or internationalization.
Thank you. Reka, I have a few questions, of course, here, and I would like to bring up one question you have in the paper of the New Economics, where you say something like, it's more of a matter of collaboration instead of top-down regulation in the new industrial policy era. Can you just give the viewers a short view on that? What is the change here?
So I'm not entirely well. I'm sure there is a change, but I think the view, and this comes out of actually seminal work in sociology that kind of looked at what the East Asia growth miracle looked like, and analyzed sort of what the government was doing in terms of industrial policy in the East Asia miracle. And what they found is that rather than sort of the government picking winners and dictating, you know, this is how we're going to achieve our goals, it was much more collaboration with the private sector, and this so-called embeddedness that Peter Evans, the sociologist, refers to in his work. This embeddedness is precisely the idea that for the government to have the necessary information, it needs to be doing industrial policy. It needs to form these dense, long-lasting connections to the private sector. There needs to be a continuous flow of information between the government and the private sector. And there's a lot of institutional ways. I think a lot of the follow-up work in decades has shown that the East Asia was just one model. DARPA in the US is another textbook model that people point to of this type of embeddedness, where there are very close links to the private sector. And the idea is precisely that this is a way, depending on in some contexts that can be appropriate, to safeguard against this idea that you can't pick winners. Of course, if you don't know what's happening in the private sector, it is really difficult for you to prioritize, to quote unquote, pick winners. If you understand what's going on in the private sector, if there's a dialogue, you understand their problems, that becomes much more working together, as opposed to the government sort of dictating and strong-arming entrepreneurs into doing certain things. The one quick thing that I would add is that Peter Evans was, of course, very careful to qualify that not only do you need embeddedness, but you need autonomy. So it's embedded autonomy, which means you need these dense links to the private sector, but of course you have to safeguard the autonomy that you're not captured by the private sector that you're working together with. And it's this fine balancing act between being close to the private sector but not being captured by them that we aim for.
In that respect, I think Sweden is well suited for this kind of industrial policy, because we have a very strong tradition of the social partners to discuss and actually lobby against the politicians in a common path together. So, I mean, in that sense, we're actually working with cooperation every day in our system. But another question I think that is interesting from the paper is that you also talk about, following the industrialization and so forth, that you have to think about industrial policy in terms of services. But what about that? Is that a different topic, or is it kind of the same with a service touch, or can you just say a few words on that?
Yeah, so I have to say that so Danny Roderick is, of course, the expert here. So I'm mostly deferring to his work, but I think the idea, the basic idea, is that for advanced economies, but also in the rest of the world, deindustrialization is sort of a fact of life. It's a fact of life that manufacturing employment is just a minuscule share of employment relative to what it was, for example, in the US at its peak. And so the idea that if what you're after is to create, for example, a good middle class, strong, use industrial policy to create a good middle class based society, then that almost certainly can't go through manufacturing, just because of the reality of how manufacturing production works these days. So, you can, with reshoring, you can bring some of the output back, you can bring production back, but because of the ways in which technological change has sort of innovated away many of the low skilled jobs, the reality is that there's the manufacturing employment that you create will just not be very big. And then the question is, can we create an industrial policy for the part of the workforce in which a large share of employment resides, and that's going to be the service sector.
Also, you have the input-output linkages between the manufacturing and many services. So in that sense, the different parts are more connected today than before, I guess. In that sense, you're more dependent of the private service sector in the manufacturing sector in Sweden today than 40 years ago.
I think that's possibly, I mean, that's true. But I mean, what I would say is that because of information communication technology, it's also become much more easy to slice the value chain, in the sense that, you can design your apples in California and make them in China. So the linkage is there, but the jobs won't necessarily be there.
No, that's true. I think one other question that I want to bring up is, what is the most important critique about the industrial policy that you view it? In Sweden, we have a long tradition of market liberals defining the policy debate. So we are always referring to the 70s, and the discussion won't go any further, because you get thrown with the 1970s in the face. So what is the main critique, and how can we develop or do you agree with me that the policy debate can be a bit backward looking?
I think to us, it's striking to what extent, the debates that we have in industrial policy are like debates from the 1980s. Like it's like, it's like we don't have a theory of modern political economy. Our theory of government is that the government is just this like incompetent monolith that can't do anything, right? To me, I think the biggest concern is the politics, the concern that what we see, and I think this is rightly so in the paper that Nathan and I have coming out on the political economy of industrial policy, we see that most of the agencies implementing industrial policy around the world are not removed from politics. They're not sort of insulated bureaucratic, technocratic agencies. And so for those reasons, I think we worry about the typical political problems. I view industrial policy I don't view the criticism that the government can't pick winners so strongly, because I think that, like the private sector, the government makes a couple of bets. It sees which ones are working, and then it needs to pull back. But the question is, can you pull back in an election year? Can you pull back when you've sort of cut the ribbon and now you've got jobs dependent on this? If it turns out that, the US is making a couple of bets in green technology and we can see that some of those are not working out, how do you make sure the industrial policy that isn't working, because we're going to have industrial policy that doesn't work, how do you make sure the industrial policy that isn't working gets removed? Because I think, to me, that's particularly in a democratic system, that is where the incentives of politicians becomes problematic, even if they're well-intentioned and they're not sort of captured by the private sector. If you have elections coming up, are you really going to be sort of removing industrial policy from your electoral base and the job destruction that will inevitably entail? So to me, I think it's, how do we design industrial policy that can either self-destruct? So can we design policy that is temporary by design? And if that's not relevant in the context, can we design institutions and safeguards that means that policies that aren't working will be removed?
Thanks. Lena, do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I do have. I think it's exactly what we need to think about in Sweden when it comes to the new industrialization that is taking place up in the northern part of Sweden. Greening batteries, doing the green steel. And from my perspective, and as you said, Daniel, we are a bit reluctant to state aid and industrial policy in Sweden, and we are not used to it. But I think we need to rethink a bit, since we need to invest for the future. But you could do a lot. You mentioned in the paper and in your speech as well, that you can have both the horizontal and vertical policy. So more of the horizontal when possible. So you invest in infrastructure and renewable energy. Competence is key, I believe. And you need to have the risk sharing. And I really liked when you said this self-destructioning industrial policy, if possible, because it's exactly spot on what you need to do. Because if it's not profitable in the future, if private capital and investments is not going into it, and you see some kind of market failure, and you believe that you need to invest in this for the future due to geopolitical reasons and the green transition and the climate goals, then it's a new situation. So once again, I really enjoyed reading the paper, of course, and discussing this. And I think you need a last word, Daniel. So I give it to you.
Yes, we are running out of time, Reka. Is it anything that you should complement that what you have said already before we leave? Reka? No, she cannot hear us.
No, she's maybe frozen.
Ah.
Too hard question.
Too hard question. Okay. But
I'm back. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. We are running out of time. So now it's about to finish, but is there anything that you should tell us more about before we finish off? Anything that you would like to say before we close? No.
Thank you. I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I've really enjoyed talking to both of you.
Many thanks, Reka, taking your time, and many thanks, Lena, taking your time. And we close now and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.